Hey everyone, just going to do another drawing video here. I'm starting this one actually kind of pre-drawing like I've done in a couple other things. I have had this, it's called oilcloth or oil paper, I think, for quite some time with the idea of making different types of stencils. And I just haven't broken it out and used it yet. So at the beginning here, I'm starting doing that. So I'll take a little while just to do this. A little bit of a time consuming process at the beginning here, but the idea I had in my head is I already, you can see it in the frame, I've got that stencil over to the side, a little wood stencil of the 9 circles in a grid. And I wanted something like that that was larger format. I've actually never looked. Should probably do this. I tend to, maybe it's because of the templates I have, but I tend to favor kind of 2 sizes of circles, maybe 3 sizes of circles in my work. But I've never actually. I just go for the ones that make sense to me each time. So I've never actually looked at like what sizes they actually are. Probably not important. Anyway, so I thought in this case that I would kind of make this fairly loose version of that grid, because you can see obviously I'm drawing the circles onto the card, and I decided as I was making this, because I had cut kind of a rectangular form, well, I might as well do more than 9 circles, because then I have choices. But anyway, my original point was I'm not measuring the distance between the circles here, so I'm not getting a clean, even grid of circles. And in a moment here, when I go to cut it out, I'm also not, in this stencil, in this case, I'm not overly concerned with how precise these circles are. I actually kind of want, or don't mind at least, if they are not perfectly defined circles. So I'm actually just using this using this little Olfa knife here, quick, just a little blade, and you can see how quickly I'm cutting around. So I'm not, I'm trying to stick to the lines I drew, but not being too worried about them being precise, especially given how I know I will likely use this is in a fairly kind of rough stenciling fashion. I'll probably either draw inside that quickly with a pencil, or I will kind of squish paint on top of it, that sort of thing. So that anyway, just making the point that in this case, I could have actually been more concerned about measuring kind of distance between the centers of all these circles, or distance between the circles, or something like that. But I just eyeballed it really quickly, which means they are, you can even, probably can't see too well here because we're far away, but I can see in this case that there's some kind of jiggling, I guess, between the circles. And in some ways I like that, because it's, even when I'm using templates and putting circles down on a page, I'm generally then eyeballing the distance between some of them anyway. And there's something actually quite nice about that. I mention kind of motion or activity in a lot of these videos, and I think that's the part of it that I like, is that isn't a sense of being too precise. There's an attempt to have alignment, and an attempt to have things that are kind of connected, or like relative to each other, but then without assuming that they have to be like sitting perfectly at the same distance from each other, or really perfectly aligned with each other. Anyway, so all that to say, I guess I'm talking over this part here just because it's taken me a while. Probably should have just like I probably should have sped this up, but I'm also trying in making these videos to be easy on myself, mostly in the fact that I don't really want to do much editing. I'd rather not spend that time. I'd rather spend the time making things rather than doing too much in terms of these videos. So they're very straightforward. Basically, I shoot the video and then I come back like I am now, do the voiceover. I don't do anything else to them. That's that. Even that process is kind of in line with a lot of how I make art. I don't. I try to avoid things that kind of get in the way or that are too far away from the actual making of things, which makes things even like documentation of work and that sort of thing a little difficult, because it's that's fiddly work that doesn't go towards the actual creation of things, but also a good thing to do. I recommend trying to document your work properly, because sometimes you miss that later on. There's lots of things I've made that are that I've either lost or that they got packed away somewhere, and that it's harder then to actually document them or to remember what they were. Anyway, maybe because I still have a few more circles to cut out, the other thing I'll talk about here is that the drawing I'm about to do is it's the second to last in this over there, the Farmers Fire Insurance Co. ledger. And so it'll be drawing number 147. So that's an interesting place to be in this case, that second to last. I found even the last few drawings, there's a weird sense of there's a pressure, I guess, that I feel that's not external in any way. It's a pressure of making sure the last few drawings are good or something like that. Maybe that pressure is also somewhat created by the fact that I've started filming them like this and doing these videos. It's not that I have to post these. No one's telling me to do this or making me post these videos. But anyway, most of my pressure that I feel in making art is a pressure of self-influence. It's things that are insecurities or that I have to work through. And it's partially even the reason, or like a part of the reason for actually making some of this art is to work through that stuff. Anyway, so yeah, this will be the second to last drawing I do in this book, and I'm actually doing this voiceover having actually done the last drawing in the book, so I'm a little bit behind. So I now know, even I won't say too much about that, obviously, because that's for another video. But it's an interesting feeling anyway to have worked through this book for so long. It's now been I guess 3 or 4 years that I've been doing work in this book, and not exclusively. I've obviously taken breaks from it and done other artwork here and there, but it has been this mainstay over quite a few years, and so it's been there as a bit of a touchstone, I guess. So anyway, there we go. I'm holding up. So I ended up doing this little grid of 12 circles instead of 9, just to sort of fit the card. Probably could have fit more if I'd planned more, but planning. Anyway, start this by just do a little kind of rough flip through, as I like to do, and ending up here on that clean page. And as usual, I don't really know what my only starting point here is. I've made this template, so obviously I'm going to try and do something with the template. This bin I have here of paper scraps is getting kind of ridiculous. I mean, I like the sense of having just random influence by having just a real mixture and hodgepodge of stuff there, but it's getting, even for me, a little bit too chaotic. I'm finding it harder to actually grab useful things from there, so I need to break it out into, like, I'm not super organize it, but do a little bit of tidying there so I have a better sense. I'm off camera now, just looking at some paint colors to see what I want to pull into here. And once I do that, I'll move in a little closer for the rest of the drawing. You might hear lots of bird song in the background. So there's a bunch of birds outside my window. We have a privet bush, and this is the time of year a lot of sparrows come and they eat the privet berries. So yeah, if you hear bird song during this video, that's what that is. So as you can see here from other videos, I'm not going for a wildly different palette. I've got this kind of pink, yellow, orange, which is a very common set of colors for me, especially as a starting point. I'm actually almost out of that one. Oh, and random, I threw in, I made a last minute decision there, and instead of the, well, maybe not instead of, but I've added that one blue, which is a different choice for me, but that one orange, so as you can see, these are all, except for one there, the one pink one that's flipped over is a Holbein. It's like a matte acrylic. But the other ones, these are all Amsterdam acrylics, and I think they're probably known as like a student grade, whatever. I don't really care about that sort of stuff, but they're nice enough acrylic paints, and then colors are pretty good. But I'm nearly out of that one orange. I believe it's Azo orange, and so I may look into getting that again. And the other type of orange I've been wanting to get, which is quite a similar orange actually, is I have trouble saying. It's like a quinacridone orange. It's that same very. It's a weird orange to describe because it's got a hints of that almost like a neon or a fluorescent or a luminous kind of orange color. But then it's got a little bit of darkness in it, a little bit of, I guess, burntness, like that I tend to favor kind of more of a burnt but still bright orange color. And I will say, unlike most of the other, most of these acrylics are fairly, they're not super thick and not super opaque, but particularly that one Azo orange is very, it's quite translucent the way it goes on, and I like that in most cases, but I would like to get something of a similar color but that is also actually a bit more opaque, just for balance. So anyway, what I've done so far here is not uncommon for me, just sort of what I'm trying to do. It's pretty neutral so far, but now I've got this big kind of swipe of this one pink, and I'm trying to just get in sort of forms and shapes onto the page so that I can react to those mostly with either whether I'm going to put down paper or I'm going to draw on. I will be drawing on top of this. And so the first kind of swipes of paint, the kind of forms that are made by the palette knife or whatever I choose to use to get it on there are mostly, a lot of it is, obviously I'm making decisions. I'm doing these kind of pulled and then square and then kind of pulled rounded forms. And then some of these very directed rectangular forms where I'm scraping the previous layers off. I've said before that it's one of the benefits of being a little bit impatient, I suppose, with working wet on wet. One of the benefits is you can actually make these kind of split-second decisions where you put some paint down and then very rapidly remove it, and it's still on the palette knife, so then you can reapply it somewhere else. So I'm using this. I've got this sort of like temporarily there, this sort of sideways L form, which may or may not stay. this is one of the nice things about working with. I had a little. I was getting too fancy there. I don't know. I was trying to do a trick or something. um, One of the things I like about working with a palette knife, especially this quite large metal one, because I use metal ones occasionally. I use silicone or the smaller metal palette knives. But the big one of the really good things about it is that sharp metal edge. And you can very easily kind of scrape away, cut away existing paint, and make some. You can choose to make quite soft forms based on your touch, and then if you press quite hard and really mean to scrape away, you can make some quite clean edge kind of forms. So that's part of choosing something like that. I think I'm digging around for some. I need some paper to wipe off the excess of this thing. I've built up a bit too much paint on that knife. It's interesting. I don't know. I haven't used too many recently, but those sort of like scrap pages that I use to wipe things. Occasionally, I'll keep those and cut them up, and they become collage materials as well. I think that's certainly not my invention. That's lots of people have done that, but it's interesting because then you get these interesting, very unplanned layered palettes, especially if I've used the same paper over multiple drawings. I'll get sort of the palette from a bunch of different drawings in one place, and that can be an interesting thing to react to. So you can see here that because of all the kind of wet on wet and that sort of thing, I've ended up with, I put a lot of paint down, I took a lot of paint back off, and I've got this sort of like kind of quarter circle form left on them because of my, I'm just cleaning up the surface a little bit because of my earlier tricky fumbling of the palette knife. I am actually a fairly clumsy person, so it's not strange for me to have done that. All right, so realizing I'm still not sure in this case, like whether I've left the orange there behind because right now what's down there, there's some good movement happening, but there's also, it's very, very neutral. But I still have that little stencil that I made there that we'll see how that ends up showing in up there. Okay, back to it. Now I brought out this whole little bin I have of these. These are they're Holbein acrylic gouache. Great little paints. They're all in these little tubes because they're just unfortunately kind of wildly expensive for what they are. But I've over time got a bit of a little collection going of them. They're just really nice in that they're. I think I've said this in other videos. They're just very highly pigmented and like they are a gouache, so they go on very opaque and they dry quite matte. So they're a nice complement oftentimes to the acrylics, because the acrylics are, even the ones that are fairly opaque, do go down and sort of you still see the paper through them, whereas a lot of these gouache colors, they really do like act as if you put down a tinted piece of paper or something like that. They've got a, like I say, high level of pigment, high level of opacity. The color there not coming through super well, but it's just like a sort of coral orange kind of color. I forget the actual name of that one. Could even be coral, who knows. So you can see I sort of went for a big circular form in the middle, and they've got these two kind of upper and lower rectangular forms, very roughed in. Still don't know where I'm going with this, but that's how these things go. I guess that's something I've said in every one of these videos too. There's no if there's ever a plan, the plan is a first step kind of plan. So really, in this case, the planning was I cut that stencil, and so I at least think to use it in this case, and then obviously choice of colors, and then everything else is kind of happenstance. Happenstance makes it seem like it's completely random. Obviously, these are all choices being made, but the choices are in the moment kind of choices. So they aren't. I'm not because this is all real time. I'm not stopping to examine too often or for any real length. Speaking of, I was talking about kind of paper that I wipe off palette knives. These pages that I'm bringing out, you can see they're on like a butcher's kind of paper. They were not kind of wipe off things, but I used to do a bunch of. I would kind of gang up like a bunch of 4x6 pieces of card and paint them all simultaneously. Put them up on a board and put them on an easel and paint multiple little paint and draw, I guess, multiple little drawings simultaneously. And so these little bits of paper are left over from that. They've just got these, so all the paint that's there is the paint that was outside of the card, because obviously I'm working on smaller cards, but I was still using this same sort of tool set, so some of the big palette knives and that sort of thing, so the paint would often go right off. But they make for interesting things because I've often used them as these kind of framing devices because they've got a clean edge, relatively clean kind of squared rectangle edge, surrounded by a lot of chaotic marks that aren't intentional at all. So yeah, I've used these a bunch of times where I want them to form kind of one corner of a framing on a drawing. So just debating now whether this is gonna kind of form another corner in this case or not. I've realized I am still going to be, I'm still zoomed out at this point, mostly because what I'm doing so far is about the broader strokes. Once I get into doing some more kind of, it's funny because the drawing that I'm doing in most cases, it's not like it's because it's not representational or figurative or anything like that. It's not drawing of anything in particular. Obviously, I may or may not do some writing which needs to be read, but anyway, this is sort of amounts to kind of shop talk. But I guess in doing the videos, that I like the distance even for myself to see the kind of bigger choices I'm making, and then once I've kind of, I guess what amounts to making a kind of ground for a drawing, then the specific details of the page become a bit more important. But right now, this is primarily me kind of getting down forms that I'm gonna draw on top of. I think it's interesting when I look at other artists' work. There's this question of what done is, and in a lot of other people's work, the what I might see very clearly as being done or clearly kind of resolved work is not usually the case for me. Like some people might get these forms down and then feel okay with these being the final thing. To me, I really end up feeling that they're just they're secondary. They're, like I say, they're kind of they're a backdrop or a ground for the real sort of drawing on top. It's all drawing in my mind. Again, this weird distinction of drawing versus painting or collage or whatever. To me, I just call all of it drawing because it ends up all being related to mark making act. And I guess when I think of mark making with different media, you could call this mixed media art making, but that terminology is pretty muddy at this point. Some people still go for that, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. But to me, I just always think of these things as drawings. Okay, so I'm getting to a point, at least with these forms. I don't think I'm going to use too much more in the way of paper here, because I've got a lot happening already, and there's a point where, in terms of putting down smaller bits of collage here, it might not work, but we'll see where I go. What I'm doing right now is actually just partially wiping off excess matte medium. I used matte medium to essentially glue down those pieces of paper, but I was also using, it's a little baby wipe that I was using. There are a few places where I was using it to remove excess paint, either from on top of the paper images or in that middle kind of curved section. So now the interesting thing is, you can see just even from the view that there's a lot of shine there, which means there's still a lot of wet paint. And so now, in the way I work, I probably, if I were to give myself better choices sometimes, I would actually stop for a while, let this all dry, and then return to it. But I just, I don't know. The way I work, I just want to keep going. It's all part of the same kind of flow of things, and so I don't like waiting for things to dry. And also, I like like I've said earlier, that having some wetness on the page can both cause problems and can also present opportunities. Like, I'm just putting in some initial just sort of motion kind of lines, just seeing where I jump around. Like, even for myself, I never really know exactly what I'm going for with these lines. I've talked about, like, they introduce motion, and they introduce sort of a depth, but still in trying to, like, what they do for me isn't entirely clear. So in this case, I'm doing two things. I've done a bit of following of the really rough tumble kind of rectangles I have already going there with the pencil, and then also these sort of mirroring or echoing some of the curved forms at the same time. There's a whole thing about scribbles, because scribbles can do a lot of different things. Like what I'm doing here, those sort of like scribbles where you stay in the same spot can almost become like shading, like you would normally, like if you were actually filling in a space with a pencil, and if you're doing like a more kind of figurative drawing, you might use a rapid pencil scribble to fill in a form that way. And then there's kind of scribbles that are almost like writing, like an asemic kind of writing, where it's not writing, but it mimics the form of writing, which I think a lot of us can kind of naturally get into that mode because we all write notes to ourselves, or we've grown up. Some of us have grown up learning cursive or learning how to print even. It's like those forms of letter making can be kind of intuitive even when you're not specifically trying to make letters. Some of those forms actually kind of come through. So yeah, there's something about this scribble, especially just with a pencil, that is it's a bit of a a learned thing, because that's our first kind of mark making things are often like a big chunky pencil, or obviously a crayon is another version of that. Anyway, I guess I should mention here, so this is my first kind of attempt using this stencil. I'm going for I don't expect this to be clean, so I'm basically just this is some matte acrylic that I'm just sort of wiping through the hole. You can see it can also, I've also sort of plopped that stencil right down on top of some paint that is obviously semi-wet underneath. So I'm probably going to get a bit of paint pulled back off of the page with the stencil itself. So we'll see how that goes. I've burned myself in the past by doing stuff like this and then ending up like actually tearing the page or that sort of thing. But I don't know. Return again to that question of why am I working wet on wet when I could stop. But like I say, it's the wanting to continue. It seems kind of simple, but it's the not wanting to stop and wanting to stay in. I guess some people talk about kind of flow state as a common thing, especially in creative work. But I think it you could apply that to anything, whether it's drawing or writing, or maybe it's even like if you're coding or even in physical activities. Kind of flow state makes sense. You've got a rhythm, you have a kind of pace or cadence to what you're doing, and having to stop doing that for what amounts to kind of a technical reason doesn't quite feel right. But, okay. Anyway, so so from my first time here, I'm just making again some pretty this pretty kind of simple choice, and you can see I'm not really trying to be very precise. I'm not expecting when I pull this up that I'm going to have a bunch of nice clean circles under here. I actually mostly just want the a bit of that grid to come through, and this is just sort of helping me start with a few of the circles pre-placed. You can see now that I'm using this, I talked earlier about how wonky this grid of circles was going to end up to be. You can see I really, especially that one kind of second from the left column of circles is kind of leaning and jiggling around, but it's that's okay to me. The other paint I'm using here, this black, is it's one of those Holbein acrylic gouache. So it actually ends up being, and the white actually is a Holbein, but it's a matte acrylic. So subtle difference. I actually don't formulation wise, I don't really know what would be the big difference between like an opaque matte acrylic and an acrylic gouache. They're kind of both. It's probably a mineral difference. I think gouaches have more clay in them. In the end, I think that's what accounts for their sort of matteness and their kind of chalkiness. It probably is clay or chalk or something like that. So you can see I did end up. I ripped a bit there. You can see around in that kind of the kind of pink and blue area there, some of the paint tore right off, leaving bits of paper behind. So now I'm just gonna my version of repairing that is actually just sort of like slathering a different this other kind of very warm but light kind of pink in there. It's not even that I really care entirely about rips in the paper, because this whole process is very messy. But and in some ways, in hindsight, I kind of wish that I hadn't put in that other pink. The previous, that kind of arc of blue and pink, even with the tears, I think was maybe nicer. But these are the effects of making decisions on the fly. Like a lot of them are not going to be perceived, to the end, to the viewer. There, I don't know if there's a right and wrong, but to me, in hindsight, they're sort of like, oh, okay, I made what would qualify, I guess, as a mistake. But as I've said again in previous videos, it's like mistakes in this kind of thing. I don't know exactly how you qualify a mistake. There's they're all just choices. Yeah, so now that I have this start of the grid up there, I can use, this is why making the template is handy, because now even though the spacing is all different, I then have the same kind of form I can go back to fairly readily. It's what I like in general about the use, I think I've said this before, but the use of templates is that you can return to a shape or a form, and have it sort of have it echo existing stuff on the page, but it's never so, or it doesn't ever need to be so precise that it ends up feeling too static. Which is also even why, like, you can see I'm doing here this, I put down the circle form, but I'm working both inside it and then also letting the kind of strokes, the scribbles, go outside the circle at the same time. It's just a tendency of not wanting most of the time to have precision. Occasionally I will use, I've got a bunch of these circular colored stickers, and they're smaller circle forms than these are, by about probably half the size of these circle forms. Those are interesting because then you get the same as when I will occasionally punch out a circle from paper, and you get this very clean shape. And that can almost do the opposite thing. Like when the shape is kind of torn, it feels like it's, although these black forms kind of look like they're punching through, but I find if it's a really clean shape, it really feels like it's kind of punching through the page, or punching through the colors. And so that can be an interesting play on a, this is working in a very kind of shallow 2D way. There's lots of layering going on here, but the layers are very thin. There's no actual real dimension here. And so I think what I go for is still a lot of visual depth, a lot of visual dimension, while still working in a very 2D way. I have done a bit of work that's more to what would be called kind of assemblage, layered forms, things punching out, which I find really interesting, but actually I find, it is a different thing. I find it harder to work in that way. I guess because it's also more, I've still done it in a drawing sense, but it's more sculptural. I think as soon as you get into a certain level of depth and layering, then you're almost dealing in a really true kind of mixed media or mixed methodology kind of way, where you're really mixing sculpture and drawing together, which is a hard balance to get at. I ended up you can see I put that bit of black over on the left hand side, and that's another kind of, speaking of, I guess, regrets or what I perceive to be errors in this case. It muddied up that one area that was kind of had that nice edge from the old milled kind of butcher paper there that I used previously. That had a lot more going on, and because I put down the black, didn't like it, wiped it away, it sort of makes that edge almost like blurry in a sense, like because the black is kind of washed out. So I'm going in there, I was putting in some more. Most of these black marks are it's like a darkish pencil or the Stabilo all pencil that I've talked about probably in every video. I've been using those two kind of back and forth recently. I've got a few other pencils that I throw in that are more like an F or even just a regular kind of HB. But those make more, I guess you think of pencil as being kind of a gray line or between gray and black, but sometimes depending on the angle, pencil can end up almost being a silver line, which can be good in some ways, but I tend to prefer a more true black line, even because I occasionally use, I used it earlier in this, there's a big kind of chunky graphite stick, which I like a lot because I like the kind of mark that it makes, and it is fairly dark, but it's not quite dark enough in a way. Yeah, I don't know, has its purpose, and again, that can sometimes just be a depth thing where the darkness or relative sort of silver to black kind of range of a pencil mark can have a different effect. So far, I mean, despite starting with this process with a fairly, wonky but still fairly clean kind of template, I'm definitely not, this is not a clean drawing. Most of mine obviously aren't, if you've been following along. Mess is kind of, mess is probably not the right word, but a line that's sort of more chaotic, and shapes that are a bit kind of tumbling are pretty common in my work. I felt like, even though there's tons of texture here, I kind of pulled out these other sheets that I've got. These I've shown a few versions of these. So these are just plant forms that I spray painted on top of, and then also the dot forms that you're seeing a bit of there. Those are also from just making simple cardboard templates and then spray painting through those, with a purpose, like I've said in other videos, of making a resource, making a material that I know I'm going to cut up and use in a variety of ways. So in this case, I think where I'm going with this is I want to take some of the, I want to kind of keep going with some of these circular forms, but then I do want some cleaner circles in this case to balance. And also, you can tell I really, I quite like having forms like this where I have this very vibrant orange color. I'll sometimes use pink in this case as well, but the vibrant orange just for me stands out even more. and I am still using the same template to draw these forms on here, but then I'll, you'll see in a bit, I'll cut these out, and then paper on top of the paper on top of the other paint becomes a different thing than my fairly scrawled and squishy kind of other dots that I've got on there. One of the things I like about these sort of spray painted pages is even sections like this where the original page, as you saw, was a bunch of circles already, and I'm actually sort of ignoring those circles and actually just cutting smaller circles out of it. But it means that, sorry, I should have done this cutting a bit more on screen. Not that it matters, I'm just scissors. But what it means is, in the end, you don't really know that these were cut from a bunch of other circle forms, but there are little kind of arcs of the kind of overspray or like soft edges of those circles that come through here. But it also just means it's got that little bit of spatter, because those were mostly orange spray paint with an intentional sort of spattered overspray of black. It just, I've said this word many times, but movement, it brings in movement and depth, instead of having, I could have, and I have chosen this too, I could have a really clean piece of pure orange kind of paper that's been printed orange, or paper, like dyed paper that's already orange. Just a choice here of having these that they end up feeling kind of planetary, I guess, because they've got this sort of texture on them. But you can see in putting them down that because they're a more clean circle form, but because they've already got sort of texture, they just sit on top of things really, really nicely. It's almost like sometimes you saw me sort of moving that around. It's almost like I'm playing some funny little game of checkers or something like that. Like, where am I gonna, which circle is gonna jump the other circles? There's also these grid forms. They often take this sort of, sometimes they'll be a pure grid, all within kind of a square form. But I tend to do these formations where there's groupings and then almost branching circles. Not sure why that is. I think, again, it's maybe just choosing to have particular kinds of motion or direction, and also I suppose it feels, they do feel a little bit typographic in their way, like almost like the like in a old LCD kind of digital displays or something, where each kind of chunk formed a letter or a number. They're just, I guess they just interest me. They're an interesting kind of graphic form. The other thing I'll just note in this case is that when I drew the circle forms on the orange sprayed paper, I intentionally drew the outline with a dark. It was I think the Stabilo pencil, knowing that it was going to impart. You can see like there's more smudgy darkness around the edge of them, and I kind of wanted that in this case. Sometimes what I'll do is, if I'll draw that line maybe on the reverse, or I'll draw it in a very a harder pencil so it almost gets removed, or I'll cut or I'll even just cut inside the line. But in this case, I wanted a bit of that like dark edge to these circles as they were coming in. Partially, again, in this case, they feel like they're sitting on top and punching through almost simultaneously. Like there's now this weird, it's almost like they have a shadow built into them. That's maybe something in like, I was talking just a little while ago about that idea of assemblage and peering through things, and there's something in especially circle forms. Maybe that's part of the interest for me is circular forms tend to feel kind of like portals, I guess. You feel like you are looking through a circular form much more so than it's a weird thought maybe, because you would think of rectangular forms, like most of our windows, our mirrors, etc. Those forms are rectangles, but there's something about a circular form, maybe because it kind of draws the eye inside of itself, because it's all edge, and yet it has no, it's the circle sort of one side or infinite sides. It's hard to say, and so it sort of draws you into it, and therefore kind of pulls you through. I don't know. So sometimes I'm not, I'm in the case, I am like I say, I'm just doing these voiceovers are just me reacting to seeing myself do things, and wondering even, wondering to myself, what am I doing there? Why am I doing that? It's part of. I don't need to know. It's not like a qualification of why, or whether one why is going to be better. One reason for doing something is going to be better than another. But there's just something interesting about trying to come to terms with, or trying to, it's like a type of self-discovery in looking at your own work in this way, and thinking like, okay, I made that choice. Why did I do that? What made me, as I've said now a whole bunch of times, it's there's an interplay here of rational and just sort of I don't want to say it's not irrational. So there's not, it's not opposites here, but it's like, think some things are getting more pre-thought, and other things are just reaction, just a whole series of reactions to reactions even. So I think I've mentioned the idea of kind of improv in these cases, and it's like improv with yourself, but there's still something like, because there's recurring forms, because there are choices that come back, or just like types of stylistic choices, color choice, the shapes of things that I'm doing recently. I've been doing a lot of these sort of, in this whole drawing here, I drew this kind of big, clumsy, wonky grid form, and then I've gone into these two kind of coral orange kind of sections here, and incised another still pretty wonky grid, but it's I used the ruler, and so there's more actual kind of straight straight, not measured still, but straight lines, and the choice to actually sort of be putting in a grid, even though the measurements aren't there. That was you saw me I almost so I did one letter form and put A there and decided I didn't want it there. Um, it's a tricky thing sometimes in terms of the putting down of actual letters, actual writing gets is interesting to me because it's maybe it's not the most intentional thing, but there's something more intentional about words and writing versus obviously just scribbles. Like I mentioned, scribbles that can take the kind of quality of letter forms. That's very different than when you actually put down a letter. And in my case, kind of the ABC kind of letters, like whether I'm just getting at the feeling of when you have something that's a letter or an actual word, there's a different part of your brain, I think, being activated to do those things. And sometimes that goes well with the part of my brain that is making these other kind of marks, and other times there's almost a friction there. And occasionally I want to use that intentionally. Like I've got all this sort of messy yet structured thing, and I'm thinking, well, if I have some words here, those words will sort of they'll almost be like a solidification of things. Like they'll connect things in a way that other marks might not. This white that I'm using here is also one of those Stabilo alls, but it doesn't. What white is a weird thing. You would think that like white, especially in pencil or pen form, it's really hard to get a big solid kind of white opaque kind of mark making thing, unless you go for something that's like a white kind of China marker will do it. It'll give you like a really strong kind of white line, but then you're also, it's because China marker is this weird kind of wax and oil combo, that it also doesn't work in the same way as this kind of marking tool. So I like white and black oftentimes in these drawings because they have a very specific effect. Black is a I use a lot of black obviously, but black is a tricky thing because black can really overpower very quickly. And as I was talking about earlier, there's different kinds of black even. So like in this case, I'm even the black of this pencil. I think this is the. Don't think this is the Stabilo all. I can't tell from here. It's not the same density of black as that matte black, the black gouache that I put down, which is that's a Mars black. I think it's a very black, and because it's also a matte paint, it just like sucks in light like crazy. Whereas these pencils, because they have to have a certain amount of kind of waxiness to them, they've always got a bit of a sheen to them, and so when you're looking at them on the page, that as black as they actually are, because it is putting down quite a black line, it because there's lights pointed at this obviously too, it comes back as looking a bit more gray than that paint does. But I like that. I like that they actually aren't quite the same black. So here's another. This is a recurring recent form. This sort of semicircles inscribed inside these grids. not sure what it what it is. They kind of form another, like I talked about earlier, the the connection of like gridded or aligned shapes on top of much more chaotic moving forms is interesting to me. And so these things that really are like, they kind of live inside the cell of that grid. Like they're very contained, um, and they're more the grids themselves, because the grids are kind of wonky. They're not perfectly aligned, but they're much more strictly aligned than certainly the full circles are in this case, because those first full circles in this drawing are sort of they feel almost like they're in motion, because they're not strictly placed on grid lines, or like I said earlier with the template that I made, it's wonky. I like even doing stuff like this, like I just did there, sort of. So it's like I have a grid that I drew with a ruler, and then I've actually sort of extended it, and I'm going over top of it, and almost like breaking the straightness of it a little bit. If you think of those grid forms as kind of structural or kind of scaffolded forms, it's weirder to kind of take them and break them up. So this is this is a case where in the end I'm happy enough with this, but the words I've chosen to write are just only coming from my head, because I think I felt like I was going too far, and even in writing words on the page, there was a sense of like, maybe I shouldn't even be writing words on this, because maybe it's done, and but once I do, it's sort of got to follow through to a certain extent. But so now in this case, like the words "stop this" are me kind of literally in this case talking to myself, but can't help myself. Here I am still putting in more lines, still like I've said in other videos, it's not a pure kind of graphomania. It isn't like there's still a sense here that I'm still making choices and still kind of playing, maybe in this case, with the idea of like, oh, I'm kind of poking fun at myself, telling myself to stop while I'm not stopping, and literally making marks that are telling me to stop. It's it's all in my hand, and yet I'm also, like I say, all the drawing is me reacting to myself, and sometimes getting excited by what I'm doing, sometimes getting frustrated by what I'm doing, sometimes getting kind of energized by myself, and other times getting annoyed by myself, and just seeing where that goes. Because even sometimes the feeling of being annoyed by myself and what that can bring is interesting to me. So this really is like I'm playing on the idea of what's done, when do you stop, and actually kind of incorporating that into the this form. And just as if I didn't make the point to myself by writing all that, I've kind of made it to myself again. Don't stop this. But you can kind of read it wherever, and then it's like, no. I'm laughing at myself, because it's sort of it's a funny thing that in the end, looking at that, no one would know that I had written the word "don't." There might be an indentation in the paper, but it's sort of that feeling of, well, I wrote it to myself, and then I removed it because it was like going too far somehow. And then of course I still making marks. All right. Well, I think I'm actually done now. So yeah, thanks for following along with another one of these drawings, and there'll be one more in this book, and then it'll all be done, and on to the next thing. Just the last sort of view from above. I like taking, even for myself, when I often stand up at the end of the drawing and just see